we've discussed Insight Plus. Now let's move on to the 6.2 preview. So this is now in the guts of Tempus, and again, lots of really good stuff coming. So we'll start that process. Now this is going to be very heavy on the PowerPoint side. So bear with me, and I'm sure there'll be plenty of questions which we'll circle back on. But where we'll start is sort of the everywhere stuff. So group these things together like we normally do around key areas of the product. You know, whether it's the forecasting side, reporting, skills, what if. Everywhere just means sort of global settings that we've added as part of 6.2. So the first one is tooltips. So we've added tooltips just about everywhere in the product. This is something that's been asked for quite some time. So both column headers in almost all of the screens, as well as the icons you'll find in project management, resource management, timesheets, skills, elsewhere, now have comprehensive tooltips. So those have been added throughout the Tempus user interface. We've also, and I'll have to laugh at this. That's actually my picture when I grow out my hair, but hopefully someone's laughing at that. Yeah, that's obviously not me. Everyone knows who that is. But we've introduced profile pictures inside of Tempus. So as a manager or end user, underneath an individual resource, you can now upload an image. If there's no image, you're going to see essentially the initials of the user. But those profile pictures now appear in a number of places. They'll appear in the resource management screens. They'll appear in your profile in the upper right corner. And there's plans to use these profile pics in other places throughout the application. So profile pics are also been added as part of 6.2. You'll also start to see, as we continue to add and update and modernize various elements of the user interface, 6.2 includes two major updates in terms of UI. That is centering of many of the screens, in particular the attributes screen under projects and the attributes and identity screen underneath resources. So this aligns very closely with some of the things we did under portfolio and project intake and workflows and forms, where they were very centered. That design look is something you'll see in a variety of screens in coming time. But right now in 6.2, the attributes panel in projects, attributes and identity panel under resources. We also added homepage messaging. So under general settings, you'll have the option to build out a message that every user will see when they log in or view the Tempus homepage. This custom homepage message is available under general settings. It allows for and supports rich text, so you can add bulleted lists, number lists, you can add hyperlinks to external resources, you can add emails, you can add tables if you wish, color coding of text, highlighting. So all of that is fully supported, text size, and so on. So you can have a message on your homepage of where to go to get help, who to contact for access or for security issues, who to go to for questions if you have internal support sites, document libraries supporting various business processes, or how to use Tempus in your organization. All of those things can be embedded inside of this custom homepage message. So very useful feature add available underneath general settings and displayed on the Tempus homepage. We also introduced a number of view defaults. Now, longer term, we're working to introduce more view management centrally. You know, we've gotten a lot of feedback. A lot of us have come from other vendors where feedback was generally, as end users, why can't we create our own views? So our philosophy has, for the most part, been let end users create the view they wish, set their default views, and so on. Increasingly, the community is asking, how can we determine that centrally? So the end user may still have the option to create their own views, but how do we manage it centrally? So we're working towards that direction to allow for more centralized management and governance of views. In the meantime, we're adding smaller enhancements along the way until we get to that full view management. And one of the first is setting a default project management view type. Now, the user still controls their default within that view type, but if you defined look, the portfolio or project Kanban is where we're going to start. Everyone should start there. Or the Gantt style display, or the grid view. So you can set a default project management view type centrally under general settings, and then the users, of course, can browse from there, but this will be their default view type upon entering that screen, whether it's project management or separately, we've done the same for report management. Now this ties in with the standard Tempus reporting. This is not Insight Plus, but you have the option of choosing, is the default report view the list view, or is it the folder view? So those of you that use folders more heavily can set folder as the default view type, and your users can switch back to the list view if they wish, but whenever they browse to their reports, report management, I should say, they would see the report folder structure as their default view. Right? So you can freely choose which of those defaults you wish to implement. All right. Now, a really big add that is part of 6.2 is, or are, roadmaps. This is something we've been working on for a while. A lot of you have asked for this. This is something that our own internal research tells us we really need to add to the product. And we've bitten off a lot. So there's still a few things that are in the works that'll be incorporated that you won't see in the screen captures, but I will talk to them. But fundamentally, we will add a roadmaps functionality. And you're going to see a few UI updates that may not make it into 6.2 in terms of like design. I'll tell you where, in particular, this first screen. So you're seeing here some planned design updates to the homepage. It's a little bit of a teaser. That's likely not 6.2, but the roadmap functionality is. So there will be an entirely new tile for roadmaps. There will be associated security as well, so we can define who can view and who can create roadmaps. They're not embedded under the PM screen or under reporting. It's a totally separate tile. And underneath roadmaps, you'll have your inventory of available roadmaps, those that you've created or those that have been shared with you, as well as the ability to create entirely new roadmaps. You'll see for each roadmap, there's a name and description. We also see the created by and date, and the updated by and date, along with delete off to the right. And there's also a search capability to search for the various roadmaps that you might have created or that might have been shared with you. Inside of the roadmap creation screen, you're going to find a large volume of configurable options, some of which are similar to Kanban, some of which are similar to Grid, and some of which are similar to Tempus what-if analysis. So beyond name and description, we have a permissions capability. Again, similar to Kanban, I can create my own view, but then I can share it with others. So we have the ability to make others or share with others available roadmap displays. We can then choose how we wish to organize the data inside of the roadmap. We support 1, 2, or 3 levels of grouping using project level custom attributes. So if you wanted 3 levels of strategy, business division, product, whatever it may be, to then organize the projects inside of the roadmap, or however you view projects in Tempus, whether they're audits, programs, or features, doesn't matter. We can group them up to 3 levels. There's various sort orders. There's different levels of granularity. We support month, quarter, and year level granularity. And you can then define your own custom range. So if you wanted to look at a 5-year roadmap, 2-year, 1 year, it's entirely up to you. These are set by default in the roadmap definition, but you will see that at runtime, you can modify these. So it's similar to report like runtime parameters that we have in reporting, where maybe the report defaults to a specific time range, but the end user can filter it to say, look, I just want to see the next year or the next 6 months. The same will be the case for roadmaps. There'll also be other options that can be enabled by default, things like showing or hiding milestones on the roadmap as well. And then you can implement a variety of different color codes for each of the group by levels. So this is really going to be the leaf level that is going to drive that color coding. But for each of the specific values within the selected field, you can apply a different color code. Now, what you don't see here, you guys couldn't fit it all on the one screen capture, is that for the projects that you're including and the filtering you put in place, you can choose which data set to render. Now, that's similar to what you'd find in what if analysis, where for each project, am I bringing in the allocation data, the demand data, as well as in this case, the schedule data. So which of those data sets is relevant to render inside of the roadmap? And I know that all of you will have different answers to that, given that some of you will just use one data set and won't care about the others. Some of you will use all three. And if you are using all three, it's important to know which of those should be set for each project on the roadmap, given that projects can be in different states of execution. And as a result, different data sets might need to be rendered. So early stage things might be demand, nearer stage things might be allocation, and then things in execution might be the schedule. So you'll have that flexibility on a project by project basis for how you draw the roadmap. Now I've brought in, excuse me, a few different displays. The first here is a monthly display of a roadmap with one level of grouping. So you'll notice what we're doing here, all of those in blue are part of the notification service. Those in orange are search algorithm. Those in green are mobile access. That is made up of, again, selection values inside of a particular project custom attribute. And you'll notice we also display the current date. So this is based on the time frame where this was run, right? So we're drawing the various projects as well as their percentage completedness. There's some other things we might be able to finalize. They might make it in. I won't speak to them, but basically imagine knowing where there's issues in these projects over time without just showing the whole project as a problem. So we might be able to identify on the bar itself just specific windows where there are issues due to things like concurrency of allocations by resources, resource over allocation levels, dependency issues. So we'll be releasing more of that information in the coming weeks, or coming days, I should say. This is now another view. This is a two-level group by roadmap, where in this case we're grouping by, again, the existing first level, but now a second level looks like sort of the business purpose or business rationale or work type of innovation, BAU, and compliance. So again, we support multi-level grouping in these roadmap displays up to 3 levels, but I've shown a 1-level grouping and a 2-level. I don't have a 3-level to show, but 3-level is fully supported. Now at runtime, you can also access additional roadmap options, as I mentioned previously, show or hide milestones, show or hide other analytical features which are not currently displayed here, changing sort order, changing the period granularity, year, quarter, or month, and also changing the time frame. So again, these are very similar to those runtime style filters or parameters that we use in basic reporting that will be available here. So roadmaps is a really big feature that is part of the 6.2 release. I know many of you are very anxious to get your hands on that due to very near-term planning or longer term for that matter, but will be available here very soon. Now, the next area that I'd like to touch on is skills management. So skills and skills matrices have been very popular across the customer base, and we've invested pretty heavily here to address some earlier stage approaches that weren't optimal, but more importantly, expanding on the functionality given your feedback and where many of our clients are headed. So under skills management, quite a bit here. So the first, and this is a really important one, was a re-architecting of the data model itself. So off on the left, you'll see the 6.0 data model, and then the 6.2 on the right. So with 6.0, the skills themselves were defined underneath a category. And imagine a category really being its own skill matrix. The skill matrix is where the data type was defined, which meant that all and any of the skills added to the category had to use the same data type. So that made organizing and putting in place widely distributed skills matrices a complex affair for some of our clients. So we've re-architected this, and on the right, this is a better depiction of where we are with 6.2. That is that skills are now defined centrally as individual distinct records. They're not defined in context of a category to start. So they're free floating, which means that each skill can have its own data type. Is it Boolean? Is it category? Is it an advanced category? Is it a range? So every skill can be defined uniquely. Then categories are defined separately as containers, and we can then associate one or multiple skill values to any container, and the same skill can sit in 1, 0, or all categories. This makes it much more scalable, much more effective, especially for the large organizations we work with, where perhaps one type of skill is used across multiple departments, and each department has a unique skill matrix, and that includes just the pieces they need to measure and manage their folks. So now, instead of having that same skill replicated across each and every skill matrix, we can now use the same skill across all those skill matrices without having to do some complex work to aggregate them. It's the same skill, it's just available in all those different categories. So this was a really important re-architecting and pretty complex effort, but something that was really important as we scale out the skills functionality. Now you'll notice the skill listing has changed. So skill management will basically have two tabs. It will have the skill tab and it will have the category tab. The skills is where we would start. And you'll see in a moment that we've expanded beyond just allowing import of skills via the API to allowing skill import via Excel, which will be massively useful for the community as well as for our teams to help customers get these data in. So skills are now defined centrally. Again, skills are free floating. They don't have to be associated to a category, but in order for them to be presented to users, they do. But then they can also be associated to multiple categories simultaneously, right? So you'd have this flat list now of skills. You'll also notice there's a little icon off to the left for information. We'll talk more about that in a moment, and lots of other things going on here, including exports and searching and so on. We've added a new skill type. So we've had range, Boolean, category, and advanced categories since the launch. We also added, based on customer feedback, an additional value called experience evaluation. It includes 4 values: no exposure, exposure, working experience, and expert. And again, we would expect over time to add more of these and also introduce options to allow you to create custom. But right now we've added just one additional skill type to cover one critical set of functionality for a handful of clients. Skill categories, as I mentioned, is now the second tab. So they're split off, so they're not uniquely defined, or I shouldn't say uniquely, but defined together. We have our skills and then we have our categories. Now, as you add a new category, you define it independently, and then you associate to it the various skills that need to make up that skill matrix. So we have a central inventory of skills. We build a container, a bucket called a category, and then fill it with the various skills that are necessary for the purpose of that particular skill category. Right? So that architecting is really important to scale this and make this more usable across a much wider and much larger organization, and one that has many, many business units or business groups. We also added some functionality to greatly simplify the process of allowing end users to manage their own skills. So in the past, you had to do quite a bit of security manipulation, either through automation or manually, to allow a user to log in to update their skills. With 6.2, we've introduced a global security setting called Edit Own Skills. If a user is a member of the global role where this is set to true, that user would now have a new option under their profile called My Skill Matrix. That setting allows the user to update and maintain their own skill matrix. They get to choose which categories to associate and then actually set and manage the skill values that are applied to them individually. And remember, then these skills flow through into reporting, advanced dashboarding, resource replace, build team, resource request workflow, and increasingly other screens in the future. So quite useful when you're looking to have a wide audience update their own skill matrix information. Right. We also added Excel export functionality, so we can now drop all of our skills or skill categories into Excel. This is all supported, so if you need to now audit this against some external system against an HCM system or some other tooling, we can very easily access all this information and drop it out to Excel. We implemented a skill expiration capability. So for many of you, it's important to know if a certain certification or accreditation or something is about to expire. Use case I generally speak to is just security awareness training. That's something we do here as part of our SOC 2. Everyone has to complete security awareness training either quarterly or annually. It changes each year. But what we can do for each resource is specify, was their security awareness training completed, yes or no? And when does it expire? So if it's set to true or yes, and we say the expiration is, let's say, the end of October, if you don't update the expiration date to now be the next year, and let's say we've breached that date, automation fires behind the scenes in Tempus, and it automatically changes the true value or yes to false or no. So there's some automation here beyond just saying, hey, it expired. Instead, it will actually change the underlying value to read false, that, look, you've breached it, you no longer have completed security awareness training. You have to update the field and then, of course, adjust the associated expiration date. So skill expiration is part of 6.2, and this applies only to the Boolean skill types. We've introduced skill search across both the skills and the skill categories. Many of you are working on or have worked with us to import pretty extensive lists of skills, some with dozens, others hundreds, and some of you with thousands. So this search functionality is going to be quite useful, especially if you need to update the names, descriptions, or make any alterations. This will be quite useful in identifying those. As previously mentioned, we did introduce skill descriptions as well. Now, these skill descriptions appear as tooltips inside of the skill matrix. So as an end user is working through the skill matrix, or a manager is working through it for a resource, this pop-up will tell us, what is this? What is the description? What should I know about this to give me context around how to actually set the value? So you can see in this case, I use security awareness training. The description is annual security awareness training is required according to corporate security/compliance policy. And that's what appears in the pop-up. So again, additional insight for end users that are completing their skill matrix, either as an end user or as a manager. We've also added Excel skill import. And this is going to be massively useful and save many of us on this side a lot of time. This will allow for two types of import. It will allow for importing the actual skill definitions. So what are the skills, what data types, and so on. But then it will also allow us to set the values against resources. So if you already have this somewhere else and you're migrating from another system, or you've done some of the work in Excel, but it has nowhere to go, we can now import it into Tempus to very quickly stand up and configure the skill matrix functionality. I know many of our partners will also be very happy with that. The skill matrix report that's built into Tempus, many of you that have these very large skill matrix configurations ran into some performance related issues. So there have been updates to both the runtime performance, moving elements from the user interface side to the server side, and the same for the export functionality. So the skills matrix report, those of you that have very large skills inventories that reported to us performance issues, both for export as well as runtime. So much of that report was moved from the UI side to the server side to improve performance. So that is likely what was missed. And then I did mention that, again, skills, many of you have expressed interest in expanding on skills internally. We have plans to further expand on it in terms of adding skills into things like what if analysis. That's come up quite a bit. So you'll start to see skills bleeding into other areas in the product as we move into 2022. All right, so moving on to timesheet related enhancements. There are a handful here that I think will be quite impactful to a number of you. They are, from my perspective, pretty impactful. The first is a new timesheet view. So historically, and we've had a good number of these. I'm not aware of anybody else having this array of views like the by period, the consolidated view, and the list goes on and on. But one that we were missing was a group by view. So I want to group the tasks into the projects, and I want to collapse and expand those. We had one customer in particular that has people assigned at the same time, right or wrong, to dozens of projects. And people need to more effectively find those projects. And their feedback, along with feedback from others, was, what if we had a collapsed grouped by view? We've seen that elsewhere. That would be very useful. So we introduced this group by timesheet view. We've added some adjustments to the UI look and feel, but this will load by default all of your timesheet in a collapsed format with a roll up to each project. So you would see read only a roll up of your actuals on each project. As you expand the project and drill into it, you would see the individual distinct tasks. Depending upon your timesheet configuration, that might be just the project level entry, which you can rename on the timesheet, or it might be all of the tasks that you've been assigned to. So that's based on your timesheet preferences and configuration. The group by view has to be enabled under timesheet configuration. And if you wish to make it your default view, you can do that, or the user can choose to do this as they wish. But this should help quite a bit in terms of identifying, where does that task exist? Because today, a lot of it, again, is concatenated. It's all a flat list. This group by will put things in much greater context for end users. We also introduced, and this is an option you have to enable, so this one's not on by default, I don't want anybody to be concerned or worried, is an ability for end users to view read-only their planned allocation or planned schedule data where they're currently assigned. The concept here is we want the end user to be able to look at that project read-only and just the planned efforts. Now, we're not doing additional screening or additional security to limit what they can see inside the allocation or demand data set or in the schedule, but let them see what's taking place. And we've gotten feedback on this, and I expect there'll be more of that in the future. But if enabled, the end user can jump from their timesheet in a separate browser tab. So they're not taken away from their timesheet where they then have to browse all around to get back. But in a separate tab, they can view read-only the schedule or the allocation or demand data for that project. Again, this has to be turned on. Some of you, I suspect, will say no way. Others, I suspect, will say that could be quite useful. And it's up to you. This is under timesheet configuration. We've also added, in the spirit of the pop-ups and task notes and tooltips, we added additional support and tooltips for unsupported tasks. So sometimes in a timesheet, the background cells will turn like a yellowish color. And oftentimes we'll get support requests asking, hey, I've got yellowish colored records on my timesheet. Why? What's happening? We just had to surface the information. Typically, these are things like the task was actually removed from Tempus. So it no longer actually exists, but you've booked actuals against it. And similar types of scenarios. So instead of just doing color coding and saying, hey, look at the help site or submit a ticket, we now have a hover over that will tell you why you're seeing a task rendered with that background cell color. So it should be quite helpful to users that experience that. On the reporting side, so we went through Insight Plus for the first hour. That, again, that's like off the charts. The reporting side here, this is a basic update to our base reporting. So I've got a whole intro slide here, but it's just really one update, which is adding administrative time. So admin time had historically not been available in the report writers. It now is available in the pivot grid and the pivot chart data models, which are really shared. They're the same data model. They're available as dimensions. So the admin time names can be added as dimensions. And then they're also available as measures, of course. So the actual either hour value or FTE value globally, so a roll up, or by the individual admin time themselves. So you'll see in this case, and this is dynamic, I'm seeing PTO, sick leave, jury duty, both hours and FTE measures, because that's how this particular instance of Tempus is configured. All right, so admin time can now be added to reports. A few updates on the project intake workflow as well as resource request workflow. The first is some of you have started going down the path of loading Tempus. So those that are newer clients that are moving off of other systems or are importing data from Excel files that are all over the company, and you've set up workflows. But when you import, there wasn't a way to specify, when I import this project, it should be of this workflow type. So that was a gap. So we had some scripting that was created to help some clients. But what we've done with 6.2 is we've added an icon into project management, where if a project was created manually or imported from Excel or imported via the API or a synchronization, and it comes over with as just a regular project without it being associated to a workflow, we now have an option where you can apply a workflow to a project. So there's a little workflow icon now off to the far right next to clone, snapshot, shift, delete, and so on, where once clicked, you can choose the workflow that the project should be associated to, click apply workflow, and it now begins its life going down that particular workflow path. So this functionality is now available through the UI, or I should say available in 6.2. Two other updates which really relate to the resource request workflow. This one is a bit higher level because there's some subtleties to it depending upon different scenarios. But in general, all else being equal, when cloning data between data sets, so when I'd copy allocation to demand or demand to allocation, if you're using both data sets and if you've enabled this particular option and you're running the resource request workflow process on the opposite data set. So let's say on allocation, I'm not using the resource request workflow, but on the demand data set, I am. When I would clone data or copy the allocation data set to demand, there are instances where where the resource request workflow would not fire. There was reasoning behind it. We've now expanded or removed that constraint so that now, if you wish, when copying data from the allocation data set to the demand data set and vice versa, if configured for workflows, the resource request workflows will fire. All right, so that's an enhancement on the resource request workflow side, starting to get a bit into very specific use cases. The next similar, very specific use case. So if you're unfamiliar, the resource request workflow process supports a more advanced mode called the trigger mode. The concept here is that normally resource request workflows fire the moment you make a change. The moment you input data and hit save, it's evaluated and it initiates, assuming it's configured. Some clients need an audit step or an intermediate step where someone else evaluates the entry before the workflow itself initiates. That was implemented or solved through this trigger mode. What it does is it relies on an assignment level Boolean custom attribute, which again, true or false. So imagine you've got trigger mode enabled, you're using a field called release for approval, you fill out the allocation, or in this case, demand data set, you hit save, and release for approval is set to no by default. So no workflow fires. Now, someone who is going to evaluate it before it actually goes to the resource manager for review and approval looks at it, says it's good. I'm now going to change the flag for release for approval from no to yes, to true. At this point, because of the trigger mode, the workflow fires. All well and good. The issue, however, is if you have to adjust that data set again and have it go back for approval, the release for approval is still set as true, which means to restart the workflow, it has to be set to false, saved, and then re-edited. So there's a lot of extra clicks that really shouldn't be there. So this little flag we added, reset custom field value after trigger fired, does that automation for you. So the moment that release for approval is set to true and the workflow fires, instead of persisting as true, it's automatically flipped back to false. So that if that end user or end users have to update that record again and have it resent for approval, they don't have to go through the whole exercise of updating the field, saving, opening again, modifying, and then releasing for approval. So it saves and eliminates a number of unnecessary steps. And again, a very specific use case, but one that I have to make sure that I cover adequately. So hopefully that's clear. All right, moving on to forecasting and planning. So this is really where we get into SPA, single project allocation, BPA, bulk project allocation, financials, and related planning interfaces. And there's a number of updates here, some pretty simple, some pretty complicated. The first is a pretty simple one. Under the project management Gantt view, we added a current date indicator. So you can now see where things sit relative to the current date with this little red line that runs vertically on the Gantt chart. We also added, this is another simple one, we added the start and end date labels to those values, which was unclear in certain cases to folks. So we've added that and made that clearer inside of the single project allocation screen. We also added, so we went from really simple to now like off the charts complicated. We added an option which has to be enabled, it's off by default, to allow negative planned allocation values. So some of you have asked, and there's actually been further asks for additional negative capabilities, which are things we're working towards, where negative values can be input as allocation. The use cases that I've seen would be things like adjustments, where maybe hours were booked somewhere that shouldn't have been, so they're then reduced with the negatives in a future month. Other cases I've heard of have been, again, incorrect time entry by end users, where periods might be closed and we're adjusting a month in the future. Others are a bit more interesting, where we just need to adjust numbers. And then there's other cases of things like attrition, where we want to model into the future sort of loss of headcount in certain cases across the board. So there are some unique use cases. They're not as widely distributed as you might suspect, but negative allocations are supported for planned allocation data set, which have to be defined at the task level. They don't work, it's not designed, I shouldn't say not work, it's not designed to work at the generic level or project level. It's got to be at a task level to allow for additional really documentation and detailing of why the negative is there. So negatives can be enabled. This is under general settings. If you wish, you can turn it on. It's not destructive in any way, but now it does allow negatives across the board. So you can't target just specific projects or just specific people. If someone can plan in a project, they can input a negative once this is enabled. Inside of single project allocation, we added an expand all. So similar to what we had in legacy BPA, where you could click one button to do an expand all. This works in both the resource tab as well as the task tab. So we can expand all to see all of the tasks or all of the resources and vice versa. Also, this update does support expanding multiple nodes at the same time, or allowing them to be expanded simultaneously. So we can expand one resource, skip some others, expand another, and those remain open in the single project allocation window. So expand all and then expanding multiple sections in SPA under both the resource tab and task tab is part of 6.2. Along the same lines, we greatly enhanced the export to Excel. So what this allows us to do is more closely mirror what is displayed inside of the SPA or single project allocation screen. We also added some formatting to very clearly distinguish between the resource and the task, literally using separate columns in the export. So again, this will mirror what's displayed and also give us a better representation of the breakout of resource and task in the Excel export. We added Excel export to the bulk project allocation. Believe it or not, this was not there. It was available in bulk project allocation flat grid, but not in the legacy BPA. There's still many customers using the conventional hierarchical BPA. It matches their business case better than the other screens. And for that reason, we did introduce the export to Excel functionality for this particular screen. Another really helpful feature that we added, and we've got this in other screens like cross-project allocation and some others. Usually, I think we have it for resourcing as well. But inside of bulk project allocation flat grid, we've added a feature where you can quickly jump to an individual project in a separate tab, or you can copy the URL and use it elsewhere. But this little icon will appear on a hover over and give you the option to click on that project. It will then open that project in a separate tab. So imagine you're working through bulk project allocation flat grid. You see some things that look off. You want to get more detail about the project, but you don't want to navigate away or open a separate tab and browse. I want to very quickly jump right to that project. Well, now you can. So this feature will let you jump right from BPA flat grid without moving or changing anything, launch a separate tab in your browser, and take you directly to that project. In BPA flat grid, we introduced a new total. So we've added a total, which you can turn on or off, which gives you the summary of demand planning resources. So currently there is or has been a total row. So you can see the sum of the work, allocation, whatever it may be, a roll up in BPA flat grid, but it included both named and generic demand planning resources. We had requests for a roll up of just the demand planning, which would be very useful, especially nearer term, to identify what is the amount of unallocated work that I have in the near term. So you can view that in reports, but again, BPA flat grid is designed for editing purposes. So you can use it as a report, but the whole idea is to allow for concurrent manipulation of your forecasts. So if you enable this total demand planning role, it'll do a sum of just the demand planning resource data, so you can identify, hey, where do I have to clean things up? So it much more easily helps you identify the near term and longer term amount of work or allocation or demand data allocated to non-human resources or non-real resources. We instituted scroll lock. So in BPA flat grid, the project, resource, task name always were locked, but the custom attributes that you could insert were not. Obviously, that could cause an issue, especially as many of those fields are very important for planning purposes to many of you. So for that reason, we instituted scroll locking, where the time phased data, the time frame that you've selected up top, that piece is really what scrolls, and it goes off screen as you move past the last inserted custom attribute. So scroll locking has been implemented in BPA flat grid. Another update we made, there are 3 screens where we did not have personalization, meaning when I went to that screen, or I'd go to the screen and I'd make changes to the layout, the filter, the fields I'd insert, I might insert skill matrix data, I might insert the location of resources, and so on. And when I'd browse away and come back and do this again, all of that had to be redone. So really, a problem for efficiency, and we made that update. So now 3 views: build team, resource replace, and the resource request workflow replace screen. All 3 now have personalization incorporated. So each user, as they make changes in those screens, Tempus remembers what they last did. So if you're doing the same thing over and over again, constantly doing replacements, constantly adjusting or reacting to resource request workflows, or using build team repeatedly, your preferences are remembered, right? So you don't have to rebuild that view every time and go through that hassle. So personalization has been added. And then we've introduced financials, a quarterly view. There are plans to invest more heavily on the financial side in 2022 based on customer feedback. So there'll be some things coming on the side. But with 6.2, we've incorporated a quarterly view. And remember, the financials are additive, so that if we've input data by month, the quarter view just does a sum. If we input by quarter, the data are linearly spread over the months, the calendar months in that quarter. And again, everything is either a positive or a negative a currency value in the financial views. So pretty simple to work with. But again, a quarterly view was added. And I believe we did it. That covers everything I've got to talk about. I need a break. I thank all of you for joining. The recording will be available. The slides will be available. And if you have any questions, please send those to us. We're pretty much out of time. We'll follow up separately. I'm sure many of you will want to drill into more detail on all of these things, from Insight Plus to roadmaps to skill matrix to other enhancements, and may have questions on other things that are in the works. Please reach out to us, reach out to me, Samantha, your reseller, your sales rep, whoever you want to talk to. and we'll make sure we get you your answers. But with that, Samantha, unless there's anything you want to share, I'm good to wrap up and let everybody be on their way.
Awesome. Yeah, the one thing I just wanted to mention, I have noticed quite a number of questions have come in over the last 2 hours, so we will be answering those separately outside of this. But again, if you submitted a question and we don't respond, or you think of something, just reach out. We would love to help. So thank you so much, Sean. That was a great presentation. Good job.
My pleasure. Thank you. Bye, everybody.
Thanks, everyone.